75 years ago, in 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights insisted in Article 3 that everyone has the right to life, liberty and security of person, while in 1950, the European Convention of Human Rights stated in Article 2 that, and I quote, "Everyone's right to life shall be protected by law. No one shall be deprived of their life intentionally, save in the execution of a sentence of a court following their conviction of a crime for which the penalty is provided for by law." Nowhere in the ECHR's 18 articles or the 30 articles of the UDHR does it say there is a right to end the life of a baby in the womb. Nowhere does it say this is a human right. And nowhere does it promote euthanasia as a human right. Given all that had occurred in the preceding years in the 1930s, it would have been unthinkable to do so. Today's worldwide epidemic of abortion and now euthanasia laws must be seen against that backdrop and in a contemporary context where care and kill are being used as interchangeable words, and where so-called safeguards, which I'll say more about later, are a self-deluding fiction. The evidence is clear. Euthanasia is being promoted and practiced in the context of a complete disregard for the sanctity of life, but also in the context of the mass manufacture and destruction of human embryos, the deliberate and grotesque creation of animal-human hybrid embryos, and in the context of eugenic and industrial-scale abortion, some of it coercive. This is all of a piece. Be clear then, it's simply not possible to allow euthanasia for a determined few without putting much larger numbers of others at risk. There won't be a little euthanasia. A change in the law becomes a conveyor belt ready to deliver euthanasia like abortion on an industrial scale. Yes, it's a slippery slope that ends in a quagmire. I'll argue today that in society at large, the legalizing of euthanasia leads to a profoundly negative shift in our attitude towards the terminally ill and other vulnerable patients, particularly disabled people. Also, there are consequences for the practice of medicine when the commitment to care becomes a commitment to providing the option of killing. Euthanasia, often dressed up as assisted dying or assisted suicide, can end up being used for people who simply have psychological or social concerns but are not terminally ill. Note too that often it's not necessarily patients but people controlling them who press for assisted suicide, that frequently there are significant problems with safeguards, that data, something that Professor Sin referred to earlier on, data is concealed, that medical care is distorted, and that a change in law divides the medical community. And of course there are also financial dangers associated with it too, and there are profound consequences for the wider society, with suicide and euthanasia potentially becoming the only choice for patients. And let me also squarely rebut the argument about pain and suffering which those in favour of changes in the law rely on so heavily. With proper palliative care, almost all pain can be alleviated. None of us want to experience debilitating or challenging illnesses, and the loss of autonomy and dignity, the suffering and pain which accompany illness. How we respond to those challenges defines what in a previous generation would be called a good death. This will have implications for the one who is dying, for the relatives and friends, and for those who care for them, and for society at large. Dependence on others is natural at certain stages in life. At birth, we were dependent on others, and for that matter, for a considerable time afterwards. Neither our entry into this world or our departure from it are straightforward or trouble-free. Dying is part of living, and that too may well make us dependent on others. We must try to be less fearful of this and question the mantra drubbed into us that independence and autonomy are themselves gods. The United Kingdom Parliamentary Committee, which looked at the issue of euthanasia, spelt out how changes to the law must have regard to the impact on society. This is what they said in the report. I quote, "Individual cases cannot reasonably establish the foundation of a policy which would have such serious and widespread repercussions. Dying is not only a personal or individual affair. The death of a person affects the lives of others, often in ways and to an extent which cannot be foreseen. We believe that the issue of euthanasia is one in which the interests of the individual cannot be separated from the interests of society as a whole." And in the United States, the New York State Task Force on Life and the Law said this: "The legalization of assisted suicide would itself send a message that suicide is a socially accepted response to terminal or incurable disease. Some patients are likely to feel pressured to take this option, particularly those who feel obligated to relieve their loved ones of the burden of care. Those patients who do not want to commit suicide may feel obligated to justify their decision to continue living." Close quotes. Professor Stephen Hawking, the English theoretical physicist, mathematician, cosmologist and author, was at the time of his death in 2018 Director of Research at the Centre for Theoretical Cosmology at the University of Cambridge. He had motor neuron disease and was massively disabled. He urged us to look up at the stars, not down at our feet. Stephen Hawking's words, his life and his achievements could be no better rebuke to the constant negativity that somehow disabled people would be better off dead. So what does this tell us about the values of a society where becoming an economic burden will determine your right to treatment, compassion or care? In a letter to the British Medical Journal entitled "How to Really Save Money in the National Health Service," policymakers argued that assisted suicide and euthanasia, I quote, "would allow health expenditure to be substantially contained." Be clear, our laws have traditionally protected vulnerable people from such pressures, but they've also protected the vast majority too, who, when the homicide law is relaxed to accommodate euthanasia, leaves people open to pressure from those who see killing rather than caring as the compassionate option. Proponents, that is, supporters of euthanasia, will tell you that theirs is an act of mercy, that they did it for the person whose mind had been shattered or who had been told that they have a terminal illness. There were around 600,000 deaths in England and Wales last year without euthanasia. The tiny number of hard cases make it into the newspaper headlines. But hard cases invariably make bad laws. We should not so easily discount the vast numbers of people who do die peacefully, knowing that they had been well cared for, but their time had come. And what of the doctors and nurses who should always be defenders of life? Don't commission them to destroy life. It's not their job, and it compromises the age-old Hippocratic oath to first do no harm. Just like we must weigh the implications of changing the law by how it will affect the sick, we must also weigh carefully how it will affect the health professional, how it can undermine the trust which must exist between a doctor and a patient. Historically, the mandate of the health carer is crystal clear. They must always care and never set out to kill or to assist in killing. Assisted living, and for that matter, assisted dying, is practiced every day by good healthcare professionals. Those who practice genuine assisted dying know that they have no duty to keep someone alive who has no desire for officious treatment. There's no moral or ethical obligation to go on receiving burdensome treatment when it's doing no good. There's no moral or ethical obligation to prolong life at all costs. And in the United Kingdom, that principle is quite properly reflected in all medical ethics codes. The principle is that a medical professional must assist with the relief of pain and the alleviation of suffering. but their motive must not be to kill the patient. Deliberately eliminating the patient is not treatment. The British Medical Association have said, I quote, "The risks of significant harm to a large number of people are too great to accommodate the needs of a very few," while the British General Medical Council was in no doubt, and again I quote, "A change in the law to allow physician-assisted dying would have profound implications for the role and responsibilities of doctors and their relationship with patients. Acting with the primary intention to hasten a patient's death would be difficult to reconcile with the medical ethical principles of beneficence and non-maleficence." Where we can't cure, society must always provide care. That is why many of the United Kingdom's medical organisations have opposed changes to the law, especially palliative care doctors. In the UK, 95% of palliative medicine specialists are opposed to a change in law. Are they all uncaring, or do they believe that there are radical alternatives to the defeatism represented by a lethal injection? I passionately support the provision and proper resourcing of palliative and hospice care. The founder of the British hospice movement was Dame Cicely Saunders, a devout Christian woman whom I was fortunate to meet. She said this: "You matter because you are you, and you matter to the end of your life. We will do all we can, not only to help you die peacefully, but also to live until you die." Let me draw towards an end by reminding you of what happens when you set in motion changes to the law. I'm going to refer principally to what has happened in Holland, the Netherlands, and in Canada. My reluctance to sanction change has been greatly influenced by paper-thin so-called protections and safeguards, and by what has happened in jurisdictions such as those. Let's give legislators the benefit of the doubt and assume that their belief in small-scale euthanasia has been driven by the belief it can be controlled and contained. Let's call what has happened the law of unintended consequences. First, recall that in the UK, legislators said that abortion would only be used in grave and extreme circumstances. There have now been 10 million abortions in Britain, one every 2.5 minutes, and in the case of disability, right up to and even during birth. Nor, as experience elsewhere illustrates, will there be just a little bit of euthanasia. In 2002, in the Netherlands, a euthanasia law was enacted. It defined euthanasia as the administering of lethal drugs by a physician with the explicit intention to end a patient's life on the patient's explicit request. But even before the law came into effect, the decriminalisation of euthanasia was a subject of abuse in the Netherlands. Since 2002 in the Netherlands, year by year, the number of deaths has increased exponentially. And within 10 years, a quarter of euthanasias were not even being reported or recorded. It had become normative and routine. An official report suggested that a quarter were being done without the patient's consent. Then it was reported that at Groningen Hospital, doctors had killed 22 babies with spina bifida. They had made their actions public so that the law might be further changed, enabling it to apply from birth. Then the Netherlands announced the introduction of mobile units to kill people in their own homes. It was reported, and I quote, "Dutch mobile euthanasia units are to make house calls. A new scheme called Life End will respond to sick people whose own doctors have refused to help them end their lives at home." And the report continued, "The teams would be limited to one house visit a week to minimise the psychological burden on them." That is, to the people operating the mobile units, not to the patients. The Dutch said that 80% of people with dementia or mental illnesses were being, their word, missed by the country's euthanasia laws, and that the doctor's clinical judgments had led to an unacceptable refusal to administer lethal drugs to their patients. The mobile death units are targeted at, quotes, unmet need, including people with chronic depression, disabilities, Alzheimer's, loneliness, and those whose request to be killed has been refused by their own doctor, their own general practitioner. It was as if the Dutch had forgotten the last time that mobile death squads were deployed in Europe. In Holland and Belgium, patients with dementia can now be euthanized. What happened here to the principle of consent? Where's the autonomy? People in the Netherlands with psychiatric disorders are now also eligible, as in the case of the 29-year-old woman Aurelia Broos, who was euthanized in 2018 at her own request because of her chronic depression. One outspoken supporter of euthanasia in the Netherlands is Dr. Bert Kaiser. He says that, like abortion, it is good that an initially tightly drawn law on euthanasia has been extended. And he says this, he wants it to go further. Looking ahead, there's no reason to believe that this process will stop in cases of incapacitated demential people. What about the prisoner who has a life sentence and desperately longs for death? When you commence a journey, it's as well to have a map which gives you some indication of what you might expect to find at your destination. Where both physician-assisted suicide and euthanasia have been legalized, data from the Netherlands and Canada, which I'll describe in a moment, show that euthanasia rapidly becomes the practiced mode of assisted death. Since assisted dying was legalized in Canada in 2016, there has also been an exponential increase. In its first year, 1,018 people died by medical assistance in dying. In 2021, that figure was 10,064. That is an increase of 889%. Over those 5 years, the law has been expanded to include people with non-terminal illness, and reports recently show requests being made and approved on the basis of poverty and lack of disability support. And proposals are now in place to allow for individuals to request made, as it's called, on the basis of mental illness. And meanwhile, palliative care provision remains inadequate. Indeed, euthanasia erodes palliative care and hospice provision. A recent report from Canada reported that a man was offered euthanasia within 2 weeks of seeking help, but by contrast, it took a year to see a doctor to treat his treatable condition. Another man, a veteran from the army, sought help, and he wanted treatment. He was offered a lethal injection. Participating doctors in Australia report that assisted dying fundamentally changes medical practice and is incompatible with palliative care. Let me end by summarizing why we should resist the legalizing of euthanasia. We should oppose it because so-called safeguards are vague and have elastic properties enabling their effortless extension. We should oppose it because conscientious objections of medics are routinely compromised or ignored, and their objection that providing lethal drugs against imprecise and unverifiable data is arrogantly disregarded. We should resist it because legalizing euthanasia means abandoning better laws that protect the vulnerable and take account of the fears of disabled and vulnerable people which are set aside. Instead of putting their energy into promoting bad laws, legislators, policymakers and governments should work instead for world-class palliative care and resources for health care that values assisted living rather than expediting death.